witnesses saw. Were his arms really raised all the way up? How many seconds did it take before the police pulled the trigger? No, I mean, what is the truth? The deeper truth, the truth that holds the power to transform, to awaken, to shape the foundations and allow something new and beautiful to burst forth. What is the deeper truth? And then once we begin to glimpse that truth, once we get a glimpse of it, it's not enough to just hold it in our minds and play around with it like some kind of intellectual jigsaw puzzle. If we're to make our lives useful, if we are to be worthy of this magnificent gift called life, we've got to get serious about sharing the fruits of this truth. I would go so far as to say we must be the fruits of this truth. In the end, there's just no escaping it. I mean, one truth about the truth is that it never goes away. It always comes back, resurfacing in new forms, sometimes masquerading in different guises, but always shows up again, daring us to face it. So will we face it? Will we face the truth, speak the truth in this time, in this age? Here's another truth about the truth. In every time and in every age, there are those who will deny the truth and those who will courageously confront it and do their best to rise to the challenge that moment in history presents. I remember when I was a kid in school, I was so ashamed and demoralized whenever teachers would start talking about slavery or Jim Crow. The textbooks would show pictures of black people hanging from trees or whites-only signs. And I read about the fact that people who looked like me were forced to sit at the back of the bus. And my teacher said they wanted us to see these pictures and learn the truth about slavery so we could understand the segregation and the horror of it all. But my teachers, as well-intentioned as they were, did not tell the whole truth. They taught us about the pain and the suffering and the cruelty, the dehumanization, but they didn't say much about the courage, the resistance, the love that endured, the songs that were born in cotton fields, and the magnificent movements that were led by people who could barely read, could not vote, people who were thought to be less than human. As Dr. Harding has written, there is a river of courage, love, and rebellion, and creative, nonviolent action. A beautiful river runs through it all. And that's the truth, too, the whole truth. And the question, I think, as we gather tonight is whether we are going to face the truth of our times and join that beautiful river, that raucous, sometimes dangerous river, or not. Are we willing to join that river and widen that river so it eventually engulfs us all, carrying us downstream to a place we all belong, or not? Now, I don't want to get carried away with metaphors here. I want to be very clear and explicit about my meaning. When I say that we need a multiracial, multi-ethnic, interfaith theology of liberation for this era of mass incarceration, I am saying that we are called to build a new moral consensus in this country, a revolutionary understanding about who we are as human beings, who we are as children of God, and what we owe one another. And I'm not using this word revolutionary as mere rhetorical flair. After years of piecemeal policy reform and tinkering with the machine, I now finally understand what Dr. King meant when he said, just months before his death, after Selma, after the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts had been passed, he told a reporter, quote, "For years I labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of the society, a little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values." End quote. Frustrated by white resistance to addressing in any meaningful way decaying ghettos, failing schools, structural joblessness, and crippling poverty, Dr. King said that America must be reborn. He said, quote, "The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against that injustice, not against the lives of their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to lift the load of poverty." And then, when speaking to his staff at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, staff who were concerned that the civil rights movement had lost its steam and direction, King said, the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Political reform efforts were no longer adequate to the task at hand. He said, quote, "For the past 12 years, we have been in a reform movement. But after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. We must see the great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. We are called upon to raise certain basic questions about the whole society." Well, today I fear that many civil rights lawyers and advocates like myself have been stuck in a model of advocacy that King was determined to leave behind. Rather than challenging the basic structure of our society and doing the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors, we have been tempted too often by the opportunity of people of color to be included within the political and economic structure as is. And we allowed ourselves to be willfully blind to the emergence of a new caste system, a system of social excommunication that has denied millions of poor people and people of color basic human dignity. I don't think the significance of this can be overstated, for the failure to acknowledge the humanity and dignity of all people has lurked at the root of every caste system. This common thread explains why in the 1780s, the British Society for the Abolition of Slavery adopted as its official seal a woodcut of a kneeling slave above a banner that read, "Am I not a man and a brother?" That symbol was followed more than 100 years later by signs worn around the necks of black sanitation workers during the Poor People's Campaign, answering the slave's question with the simple statement, "I am a man." And yet here we are, decades later, with a black man in the White House and most Americans claiming to be colorblind, and thousands of people are holding signs eerily reminiscent of eras we supposedly left behind, reminding a forgetful nation that Black lives matter. The fact that a sign is necessary like that today in protest of yet another caste-like system suggests that the model of civil rights advocacy that has been employed for the past several decades is not, as King predicted, adequate to the task at hand. If we can agree that what is needed now at this critical juncture is not mere tinkering or tokenism, but as King insisted more than 40 years ago, a radical restructuring of our society, then perhaps we can also agree that a radical restructuring of our approach to advocacy is in order as well. And I dare say, though I'm not a theologian, perhaps a radical new approach to our theology is in order as well. For those of us who consider ourselves people of faith and people of conscience, we must acknowledge that we have been far too quiet for far too long as our nation built a penal system predicated on denying to God's children the very forms of forgiveness, compassion, and opportunities for redemption that we claim to cherish. What sort of theology tolerates this complicit silence? Perhaps the revolution must first begin within us. Of course, there are those who tell me that my newfound revolutionary spirit is misplaced, especially now that there is so much progress being made through traditional political channels to end mass incarceration in America. I'm often asked, aren't I thrilled by marijuana legalization? Aren't I delighted that the Koch brothers and Newt Gingrich are sitting down at the same table with the ACLU and the Center for American Progress to come up with a grand plan to end mass incarceration? Aren't I glad that President Obama granted clemency to 8 people convicted of nonviolent drug offenses? Isn't it great that the Justice Department just issued a report finding a pattern of practice of discrimination in the Ferguson Police Department? Aren't I delighted that the new mayor of New York City finally settled the stop and frisk case? Over and over again, people ask me, did you ever think back when you were writing your book that any of this would be possible? I have to say, yes. I definitely thought it was possible, and in many ways, it is what I feared. As a nation, we are on the verge of doing many of the right things for the wrong reasons. Now, don't get me wrong, I am a supporter of marijuana legalization. In fact, I believe that simple possession of all drugs for personal use should be decriminalized. I believe we should follow the example set by of the simple possession of all drugs, and after 10 years, they reported rates of drug addiction and abuse went down as they reinvested all that money they spent caging people into drug treatment, providing education and support to people who may be at risk of drug addiction. And I am glad there is emerging bipartisan support for reducing harsh mandatory minimum sentences for some nonviolent drug crimes, as well as reforms for, mentally ill people that make it more likely that they'll get health care treatment rather than a jail cell. But when considering whether marijuana legalization and the recent bipartisan initiatives represent genuine progress, and by that I mean truly transformational change, I think we should ask ourselves, have we as a nation changed our minds about the dignity and value of those people whose lives have been destroyed by the drug war? Or have we simply changed our minds about marijuana? If legalization is motivated primarily by our changing views of the drug, the growing consensus in the medical community that marijuana is actually less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, but our views about them, those who've been targeted en masse for minor drug crimes, hasn't really changed, then we haven't made much progress from a racial justice perspective. Similarly, we've got to ask ourselves whether the primary engine driving the new bipartisan enthusiasm for criminal justice reform, whether that enthusiasm has been driven primarily by a new awakening to the value of the lives and communities that have been destroyed, or is this enthusiasm driven primarily by concerns about the costs of this massive prison state and reluctance to raise taxes on the predominantly white middle class? Truly transformative change will come when and only when we change rules, laws, policies, and practices because we have opened our hearts and our minds for the better, regarding the dignity and value of all people, of all colors, no matter who they are, where they came from, or what they may have done. What we know, what we certainly ought to know by now, is that systems of racial and social control adapt and morph over time, adapting to the needs and constraints of the time. And ultimately, what lies at the core of the current caste system is a flawed public consensus, a failure to care, to really care across the lines of race and class, the belief that some lives simply don't matter. And it is this failure to care that lies at the core of every caste-like system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. So I rejoice for the lives that may be spared by this new bipartisan alliance, but I am filled with grief for the lives we will certainly lose tomorrow if we do not find a way to steer this ship in a radically different direction and develop a new moral consensus. And so, yes, I am glad that the new mayor of New York has stopped fighting the brilliant litigation brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights challenging the city's discriminatory and abusive stop and frisk practices. But I have to pause and take a deep breath as I consider how far he and we have truly come. For even as he entered into a landmark consent decree and spoke the truth about his son and what he needs to be aware of when dealing with the police, he has practically in the same breath clung to and reaffirmed the cruel and immoral doctrine known as broken windows policing. And for those who are unfamiliar, broken windows policing is the notion that the best way to make our community safe and secure is to come down with a hammer on people who commit the most minor of infractions. Not on all people, of course, for broken windows policing is not practiced in the wealthy neighborhoods, but only in the poorest and most vulnerable communities of color. The notion that to effectively deal with them, the others, we must arrest and fine and cite people en masse for things like selling untaxed cigarettes, riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, or jaywalking. This zero-tolerance, purely punitive mentality and impulse believing this is how